Good evening, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Callipolis Radio. Tonight, I'll be reading more of Arthur Schopenhauer's collected aphorisms. This section is titled, On Books and Writing. Thanks for listening. Writers can be divided into meteors, planets, and fixed stars. The first produce a momentary effect. You gaze up, cry, "Look!" and they vanish forever. The second, the moving stars, endure for much longer. By virtue of their proximity, they often shine more brightly than the fixed stars, which the ignorant mistake them for. But they too must soon vacate their place. They shine, moreover, only with a borrowed light, and their sphere of influence is limited to their own fellow travelers, their contemporaries. The third alone are unchanging, stand firm in the firmament, shine by their own light, and influence all ages equally, in that their aspect does not alter when our point of view alters, since they have no parallax. Unlike the others, they do not belong to one system, nation, alone. They belong to the universe. But it is precisely because they are so high that their light usually takes so many years to reach the eyes of the dwellers on earth. There are, above all, two kinds of writer: those who write for the sake of what they have to say, and those who write for the sake of writing. The former have had their ideas or experiences which seem to them worth communicating. The latter need money, and that is why they write, for money. They think for the purpose of writing. You can recognize them by the fact that they spin out their ideas to the greatest possible extent, that their ideas are half-true, obscure, forced, and vacillating, and that they usually prefer the twilight, so as to appear what they are not, which is why their writings lack definiteness and clarity. You can soon see they are writing simply in order to cover paper, and as soon as you do see it, you should throw the book down, for time is precious. Payment and reserved copyright are at the bottom the ruin of literature. Only he who writes entirely for the sake of what he has to say writes anything worth writing. It is as if there were a curse on money. Every writer writes badly as soon as he starts writing for gain. The greatest works of the greatest men all belong to a time when they had to write them for nothing, or for very small payment. So that here too the Spanish proverb holds good: honor and money don't belong in the same purse. A multitude of bad writers lives exclusively on the stupid desire of the public to read nothing but what has just been printed. The journalists. Well named! In English, the world means day laborers. And then again, there can be said to be three kinds of author. Firstly, there are those who write without thinking. They write from memory, from reminiscence, or even directly from other people's books. This class is the most numerous. Secondly, there are those who think while writing. They think in order to write. Very common. Thirdly, there are those who have thought before they started writing. They write simply because they have thought. Rare. Even among the small number of writers who actually think seriously before they start writing, there are extremely few who think about the subject itself. The rest merely think about books, about what others have said about the subject. They require, that is to say, the close and powerful stimulation of ideas produced by other people in order to think at all. These ideas are then their immediate theme, so that they remain constantly under their influence, and consequently never attain to true originality. The above-mentioned minority, on the other hand, are stimulated to think by the subject itself, so that their thinking is directed immediately to this. Among them alone are to be discovered those writers who endure and become immortal. Only he who takes what he writes directly out of his own head is worth reading. A book can never be more than a reproduction of the thoughts of its author. The value of these thoughts lies either in the material, that is, in what he has thought upon, or in the form, that is, the way in which the material is treated, that is, in what he has thought upon it. The upon what is manifold, as are the advantages it bestows on books. All empirical material, that is, everything historically or physically factual in itself and in the widest sense, belongs here. The characteristic quality lies in the object, so that the book can be an important one, whoever its author may be. In the case of the what, on the other hand, the characteristic quality lies in the subject. The topics treated can be such as are accessible and familiar to all men, but it is the form in which they are comprehended, the what of the thought, which here bestows value, and this lies in the subject. If, consequently, a book of this sort is admirable and unique, its author is so too. From which it follows that the merit of a writer who is worth reading is the greater the less it owes to his material, and even the more familiar and much employed this material is. Thus, for example, the 3 great Greek tragedians all employed the same material. Thus, when a book becomes famous, you should firmly distinguish whether it is on account of its material or on account of its form. The public is much more interested in the material than in the form. It displays this tendency in its most ridiculous shape in regard to poetic works, in that it painstakingly tracks down the real events or personal circumstances which occasioned the work, and these indeed become more interesting to it than the works themselves, so that it reads more about than by Goethe, and studies of the Faust legend more assiduously than Faust. And if Bürger once said, quote, "They will undertake learned research into who Lenora really was," we have seen this literally come to pass in the case of Goethe. This preference for the material as against the form is as if one should ignore the form and painting of a beautiful Etruscan vase in order to carry out a chemical analysis of the pigment and the clay. The actual life of a thought lasts only until it reaches the point of speech. There it petrifies and is henceforth dead, but indestructible, like the petrified plants and animals of prehistory. As soon as our thinking has found words, it ceases to be sincere or at bottom serious. When it begins to exist for others, it ceases to live in us, just as the child severs itself from its mother when it enters into its own existence. Literary periodicals ought to be the dam against the ever-rising flood of bad and unprofitable books produced by the unprincipled scribbling of our age. With the incorruptibility, judiciousness, and severity of their judgments, they should scourge without mercy all patchwork put together by incompetence, all the page-filling through which empty heads seek to fill their empty pockets, which is to say 9/10 of all books, and thus work against triviality and imposture as their duty dictates. Instead of which they promote these things, and their abject tolerance allies itself with author and publisher to rob the public of its time and money. Their writers are as a rule professors or literati, who, because of low salaries or poor payment, write from need of money. So, since they all have a common aim, their interests are in common. They keep together, mutually sustain one another, and speak in favor of one another. This is the origin of all the laudatory reviews of bad books which constitute the content of literary periodicals. Their motto ought to be, "Live and let live." Anonymity, that shield for every kind of literary scoundrelism, must disappear. The pretext for its introduction into literary periodicals was that it protected honest critics from the wrath of authors and their patrons. But for every case of this kind, there are 100 cases where it serves merely to allow complete irresponsibility to reviewers who would be unable to defend what they write, or even to conceal the shame of those so venal and abject as to recommend books to the public in exchange for a tip from their publisher. It often merely serves to cloak the obscurity, incompetence, and insignificance of the reviewer. It is unbelievable what impudence these fellows are capable of. and from what degree of literary knavery they will not shrink, once they know themselves secure in the shadow of anonymity. Rousseau already said in the preface to La Nouvelle Heloise, "Every honest man puts his name to what he writes, and universally affirmative propositions can be reversed per contrapositionem." How much more this applies to polemical writings, which reviews usually are. Style is the physiognomy of the mind. It is less deceptive than that of the body. To imitate the style of another is to wear a mask, and however beautiful this may be, its lifelessness soon makes it seem insipid and unendurable, so that the ugliest living face is preferable. Stylistic affectation can be compared to pulling faces. To arrive at a provisional assessment of a writer's worth, it is not necessary to know what or upon what he has thought, because that would mean having to read everything he has written. It is sufficient, in the first instance, to know how he has thought. Now, an exact impression of this how of his thinking, of its essential nature and prevailing quality, is provided by his style, for this reveals the formal nature of all a man's thoughts, which must always remain the same no matter what or upon what he thinks. It is, as it were, the paste from which he molds all his figures, however various they might be. Just as Eulenspiegel, when asked how long it would take to reach the next town, gave his questioner the apparently senseless answer, "Walk," with a view to judging from his place how far he would get in a certain time. So I read a couple of pages of an author, and already know more or less how far I can profit from him. The first rule, indeed by itself virtually a sufficient condition for good style, is to have something to say. The dullness and tediousness of the writings of commonplace people might be a consequence of the fact that they are speaking only half-consciously, that is to say, not really understanding the meaning of the words they use, since these are something they have learned and received finished and complete, so that what they put together is rather whole phrases than individual words. This is the origin of the palpable lack of distinct ideas which characterize their writings, since they are without that which imposes distinctness on ideas, individual clear thinking. Instead of this, we meet with an obscure instinct welter of words, with current phrases, hackneyed expressions, and fashionable locutions. Their nebulous productions consequently resemble printing with worn-out type. With regard to the tediousness in writing touched on above, one should add the general observation that there are two kinds of tediousness, an objective and a subjective kind. The objective kind always derives from the deficiency in question, that is, from the fact that the author has no clear ideas or information whatsoever to communicate. For he who has them goes about communicating them in a direct manner, and consequently everywhere presents clear, distinct concepts, so that he is neither verbose, nor obscure, nor confused, and consequently he is not tedious. Even if his leading idea is false, it is in this event still clearly thought and well considered, that is to say, at least formally correct, so that what he writes always retains some value. On the other hand, an objectively tedious work is, for the same reason, always worthless in every respect. Subjective tediousness, on the contrary, is only relative. It originates in a lack of interest in the subject on the part of the reader. This, however, originates in the reader's limitations. The most admirable work, consequently, can be subjectively tedious, namely to this or that reader, as conversely the worst can be subjectively entertaining to this or that reader, because the subject or the writer interests him. An affected writer is like a man who dresses up so as not to be confused and confounded with the mob, a danger which a gentleman, however ill-clad, never runs. As a certain over-dressing thus betrays the plebeian, so an affected style betrays the commonplace mind. Nevertheless, it is a misguided endeavor to try to write exactly as you speak. Every style of writing should rather retain a certain vestige of affinity with the lapidary style, which is indeed the ancestor of them all. This endeavor is consequently as objectionable as its converse, that is, to try to speak as you write, which is at once pedantic and hard to understand. Obscurity and vagueness of expression is always and everywhere a very bad sign, for in 99 cases out of 100 it derives from vagueness of thought, which in turn comes from an original incongruity and inconsistency in the thought itself, and thus from its falsity. If a true thought arises in a head, it will immediately strive after clarity, and will soon achieve it. What is clearly thought, however, easily finds the expression appropriate to it. The thoughts a man is capable of always express themselves in a clear, comprehensible, and unambiguous word. Those who put together difficult, obscure, involved, ambiguous discourses do not really know what they want to say. They have no more than a vague consciousness of it which is only struggling towards a thought. Often, however, they also want to conceal from themselves and others that they actually have nothing to say. Truth is fairest naked, and the simpler its expression, the profounder its influence. What declamation over the vanity of human existence, for example, can well make a greater impression than Job's? Man that is born of a woman is of few days, and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not. It is for just this reason that the naive poetry of Goethe stands so incomparably higher than the rhetorical poetry of Schiller. And it is this that accounts for the powerful effect of many folk songs. Everything superfluous is prejudicial. More than 9/10 of all literate men and women certainly read nothing but newspapers, and consequently model their orthography, grammar, and style almost exclusively on them, and even in their simplicity regard the murdering of language which goes on in them as brevity of expression, elegant facility, and ingenious innovation. Indeed, young people of the unlearned professions in general regard the newspaper as an authority, simply because it is something printed. For this reason, the state should, in all seriousness, take measures to ensure that the newspapers are altogether free of linguistic errors. A censor should be instituted who, instead of receiving a salary, should receive 1 louis d'or for every mangled or stylistically objectionable word, error of grammar or syntax, or misemployed preposition he discovers in them, and 3 louis d'or for every instance of sheer impudent mockery of all style and grammar, with double the sum for any repetition, the amounts to be defrayed by the perpetrators. Or is the German language perhaps anyone's game, a trifle not worthy of that protection of the law which even a dunghill enjoys? Miserable Philistines! What in the world is to become of the German language if every scribbler and newspaper writer is granted discretionary power to do with it whatever his caprice and folly suggest? An error of style, which, with literature in decline and the ancient languages neglected, is becoming more and more common, but is really at home only in Germany, is its subjectivity. It consists in this, that the writer is satisfied so long as he himself understands what he means. The reader may be left to make of it what he can. Unconcerned with this difficulty, the writer proceeds as if he were engaged in a monologue, while what should really be taking place is a dialogue, and indeed one in which the speaker has to express himself the more clearly, in that he cannot hear the listener's questions. It is for just this reason that a style should not be subjective, but objective. An objective style is one in which the words are so arranged that the reader is downright compelled to think exactly the same thing as its author has thought. But this will come about only if the author continually remembers that thoughts obey the law of gravity to this extent, that they travel much more easily from head down to paper than they do from paper up to head, so that for the latter journey they require all the assistance we can give them. If it is achieved, the words operate in a purely objective way, like a completed oil painting, while the subjective style is hardly more effective than a series of blots on a wall. Only he whose imagination has chanced to be aroused by them can see in them shapes and pictures, and to others they are merely blots. The distinction in question applies to the whole mode of communication, but it can often be demonstrated in individual passages too. For example, I have just read in a new book, quote, "I have not written so as to increase the number of existing books," unquote. This says the opposite of what the writer intended, and is moreover nonsense. He who writes carelessly makes first and foremost the confession that he himself does not place any great value on his thoughts. For the enthusiasm which inspires the unflagging endurance necessary for discovering the clearest, most forceful, and most attractive form of expressing our thoughts is begotten only by the conviction of their weightiness and truth, just as we employ silver or golden caskets only for sacred things, or priceless works of art. Very few write as an architect builds, drawing up a plan beforehand and thinking it out down to the smallest details. Most write as they play dominoes. Their sentences are linked together as dominoes are, one by one, partly deliberately, and in part by chance. The guiding principle in the art of composition should be that the human being can think clearly only one thought at a time, so that he should not be asked to think two, not to speak of more than two thoughts at the same time. But this is what he is being asked to do when parentheses are inserted into sentences which have been broken up to accommodate them, a practice which causes unnecessary and wanton confusion. German writers are the worst offenders in this respect. That their language lends itself to it more readily than other living languages may account for the fact, but does not make it commendable. The prose of no language reads so pleasantly and easily as does that of the French, and this is because it is, as a rule, free of this error. The French writer sets his thoughts down one after the other in the most logical and natural order possible, and thus places them before his reader in succession, so that the reader can give his undivided attention to each of them. The German, on the other hand, weaves them together into an involved and twice involved and thrice involved period because he insists on saying 6 things at once instead of presenting them one after the other. The true national characteristic of the Germans is ponderousness. It is evident in their gait, their activities, their language, their speech, their mode of narrating, their way of understanding and thinking, but especially in their style of writing, in the pleasure that they take in long, ponderous, involved periods, where the memory has to bear the burden for a good 5 minutes, patient and unaided, until, at the end of the period, reason comes into action and the conundrum is solved. This is the kind of thing they enjoy, and if affectation and bombast can be introduced as well, the author will revel in it. But heaven help the reader. It is obviously counter to all sound reason to clap one thought down straight over another, as if making a cross. But this is what happens when a writer interrupts what he has started to say in order to say something quite different in the middle of it, thus leaving a meaningless half-period in the custody of the reader until the other half comes along. It is like handing a guest an empty plate and leaving him to hope that something will appear on it. This form of construction reaches the height of tastelessness when the parentheses are not even dovetailed organically into the period, but, by making a straight breach into it, simply wedged in. If it is an impertinence to interrupt others, it is no less of an impertinence to interrupt oneself, as happens in a form of construction which for some years now every inferior, careless, hasty scribbler with visions of payment before his eyes has employed 6 times on every page, and enjoyed doing so. It consists, precept and example should, where possible, go together, in breaking off one phrase in order to stick another onto it. They do it, however, not only from laziness, but also from stupidity, in that they take it for a pleasant légèreté, which enlivens the discourse. In rare individual cases, it may be excusable. No literary quality, persuasiveness, for instance, or richness of imagery, a talent for metaphors, boldness, astringency, conciseness, gracefulness, facility of expression, wit, striking contrast, laconism, simplicity, can be acquired by reading writers who display it. But if we already possess any such quality as a natural tendency, that is potentia. We can, by reading, summon it up in ourselves, become conscious of it, see what can be made of it, be fortified in our inclination, indeed in the courage to employ it, judge of its effectiveness, and thus learn how to use it correctly. And only then shall we possess it actu. This, then, is the only way in which reading can teach writing. It instructs us in the use we can make of our own natural gifts. Thus, it can instruct us only when we possess such gifts. If we do not possess them, we can learn from reading nothing but cold, dead mannerism, and become superficial imitators. As the strata of the earth preserve in succession the living creatures of past epochs, so the shelves of libraries preserve in succession the errors of the past and their expositions, which, like the former, were very lively and made a great commotion in their own age, but now stand petrified and stiff in a place where only the literary paleontologist regards them. According to Herodotus, Xerxes wept at the sight of his enormous army, to think that, of all these men, not one would be alive in 100 years' time. So, who cannot but weep at the sight of the thick, fair catalogue, to think that of all these books, not one will be alive in 10 years' time? The art of not reading is a very important one. It consists in not taking an interest in whatever may be engaging the attention of the general public at any particular time. When some political or ecclesiastical pamphlet, or novel, or poem, is making a great commotion, you should remember that he who writes for fools always finds a large public. A precondition for reading good books is not reading bad ones, for life is short. Buying books would be a good thing, if one could also buy the time to read them in. But as a rule, the purchase of books is mistaken for the appropriation of their contents. In the history of the world, half a century is a considerable period, because its material is always changing, inasmuch as something is always happening. In the history of literature, on the other hand, half a century is often no time at all, because nothing has happened. Things are as they were 50 years before. It is consistent with this state of things that we should see the scientific, literary, and artistic zeitgeist declared bankrupt about every 30 years. For during this period, the errors contained in it have grown to such proportions as to crush it by the weight of their absurdity, while the opposing view has at the same time been strengthened by them. So now there is a sudden change, but what often succeeds is an error in the opposite direction. To exhibit the periodical recurrence of this state of things would be the true pragmatic material of literary history. I wish someone would one day attempt a tragic history of literature, showing how the various nations which now take their highest pride in the great writers and artists they can show treated them while they were alive. In such a history, the author would bring visibly before us that endless struggle which the good and the genuine of all ages and all lands has to endure against the always dominant bad and wrong-headed. Depict for us the martyrdom of almost every genuine enlightener of mankind, almost every great master of every art, show us how, with a few exceptions, they lived tormented lives in poverty and wretchedness, without recognition, without sympathy, without disciples, while fame, honor, and riches went to the unworthy. How, that is, their lot was that of Esau, who, while out hunting and catching game for his father, was robbed by Jacob of his father's blessing. But how, in spite of all, love of their cause sustained them, until the hard struggle of such an educator of the human race was at last consummated. The never-fading laurel wreath beckoned, and the hour struck in which for him, too, the heavy armor becomes the light dress of childhood, the pain is brief, and the joy unending.